Hello, folks. This is Detroit Miracle. Yes, and indeed. Right now, I am here to review Star Wars Andor Season 2, last three episodes. And those episodes were 10, 11, and 12. Okay, folks. So it started off with a basic storyline. Nothing exciting happened in the very beginning to lead everything off. But nevertheless, I was still focused on the story because I wondered where it was headed. Even if it took a little bit longer to get there, I figured eventually it would arrive there. So I had optimism for something to happen near the end or at the end, somewhere around those periods or that time. So I watched it. It starts off, and then eventually they killed off a main character in the entire series. The guy they killed off was Lucian. He's supposed to be a principal Rebel Alliance leader, but he leads in his own way. He's like the Rebel Alliance spy. Like the Rebel Alliance is militarized and all, but it also has some kind of spy network connected to it. And Lucian would be the equivalent to the spy network for the Rebel Alliance, just as the ISB represents the spy agency or internal security agency for the Empire. So Lucian sort of embodies that. He apparently has so many contacts, so much money, so much influence in the underbodies of society as well as in the high societies, because he's a art dealer and he deals in antique art. So he's incredibly wealthy, in other words. So this guy, they killed him off, and it seemed to make sense because he wasn't in Rogue One or the first trilogy. And Lucian, if he was around, he would have been in all movies, or it would have made sense that he would have been involved in the Rebel Alliance's further key struggles against the Empire, such as in The Empire Strikes Back and Return of the Jedi, and certainly A New Hope. So they killed this character off, and then something happened where they managed to keep him alive, and then so on and so on. I'm not going to spoil everybody's surprise and give everything away, but I found that to be a great storyline there. It was interesting. It wasn't necessarily great, but it was interesting the way they killed him off. And then, of course, then the next plan is to disconnect him from his life support system at the hospital, and that goes off. And then all of a sudden, the Empire is on to Lucian and his network, so to speak. The Rebel Alliance is so complicated and complex that it's divided in ways. So Lucian isn't directly tied to the militarized Rebel Alliance in a way. He's like more like a internal type of security person that does whatever he has to do to preserve the Rebel Alliance. So he would be the equivalent of a Section 31 for another popular franchise that is epic sci-fi. But getting back to Andor, so it moved on, and it seemed from that point everything was advancing forward. And we all know where that was headed. It was headed to Rogue One and the eventual first three movies. So at a certain point, Andor sort of felt a bit like Rogue One because he changed his outfit, he cut his hair, so he seemed more like his Rogue One character. So everything seemed to be building towards that. But I can't say that nothing epic, shocking, astounding happened near the end or at the end. It was just more like connecting the dots which lead up to the eventual films that would come out. So everything was like fill in the blank sort of, which led up to it. It wasn't necessarily completely boring, but I expected something bigger and epic. Oh yeah, that's right. They showed Krennic standing in an observation lounge or on a Star Destroyer looking at the Death Star, and it seemed nearly finished. So, like I said, everything is heading into Rogue One there, and we know it happened later. We know what the eventuality is for the Death Star. But that's the big secret in Andor. In both Andor seasons, that was the big secret at that time, the Death Star. And once that got leaked, once the rebels were on to it, they were able to destroy it. So, in other words, if the Rebel Alliance would have found out about it 10 years or 15 years earlier than that, then they would have had more preparation time and maybe they could have destroyed it earlier. Because it seems like they are a type of kink in Darth Sidious's back. So you know how he feels about the Rebel Alliance. He already destroyed the Jedi Order, and then the Rebel Alliance pop up. And the Rebel Alliance seemed to be more equipped than the New Republic was to deal with him, because in all actuality, they weren't necessarily fighting against the separatists. They were fighting against an outside extremist, which was Palpatine, Vader, and the Empire, in which they didn't subscribe to. So this is the Rebel Council, the Rebel Alliance Council, and they sort of share similar beliefs as that. And they could be seen at a certain point during the last 3 episodes sitting around a table. And the table might remind you of the Jedi Council, where they sat around like that. And these are prestigious Rebel Alliance leaders, and they're rich aristocrats. Well, we know Bail Organa and Mon Mothma is real wealthy and enriched and privileged and high society of that galaxy, but it's another guy that holds prestige, but I believe he's a general. I'm not sure he's a aristocratic dude. So it stands to reason that the military or parts of it would turn against Palpatine and join the Rebel Alliance, because everybody in the galaxy that's military minded wouldn't necessarily subscribe to the Empire, so they would join the Rebel Alliance if they're looking to hold the galaxy together, keep up the fight, return things to a much better situation prior to Andor. That's what they're fighting for. They're fighting for 20 years ago or 20 or 30 years ago, 40 years ago, when everything was much, much better in the galaxy. But the Sith were still around plotting and scheming, and then eventually things came to a head. So in Andor, at the end or very close to the end, things sort of fell into place with it, and you like, okay, I know how things connect up now. I believe Andor even changed his blaster pistol into the one that he carried in Rogue One, because he was carrying something else the entire season 2, and then he switched to that one. So everything ties in, but I wanted to see something a little bit more exciting, and I'm sure the fans did too. You know, the way they tied that in neatly was cool though, but you know, you expect like a little bit more. Like they could have thrown in shock surprises, a Luke Skywalker cameo, like show him on the farm on Tatooine. Look, they could have did anything, but apparently they went the direction they went, so it is what it is. All right, folks. Thanks for tuning in, and please give me those likes, comments, and please subscribe to me, Detroit Miracle. Thank you.